I have fixed clocks for 41 years. That is the whole of my life, more or less. A small shop on Cathedral Row in the city of Marin with a bell over the door that I never got around to oiling. I know what a second sounds like. I know it the way a baker knows flour. And I am telling you this because it matters later, because on the morning they buried Queen Adaline, there was a stretch of about 9 seconds where the whole country stopped breathing, and I was probably the only man on that street counting them. 9 seconds, that's all it took for a soldier to ruin his life. Except he didn't. And that's the part I still can't tell without my voice going somewhere strange. Let me set it properly for you. It was the 11th of November, cold. Not the pretty kind of cold either, not the postcard kind with frost on the railings. It was that wet, gray, get-into-your-bones cold that Marin does so well in November. The sky was the color of an old coin. It had rained through the night and stopped around 5 in the morning, and everything was still dripping. The plane trees along the row, the awnings, the iron barriers they'd put up 3 days before, everything dripping. People had started arriving at 4 in the morning, 4 in that weather. I opened my shutters at 6:30, and there were already maybe 200 of them pressed along the barricade outside my window, and by 8 there was no counting. They had come with folding stools and flasks. A woman near my door had brought a thermos of soup and was pouring capfuls of it for strangers. A man in a good coat was crying without making any noise at all, just standing there, letting it happen, like the rain had got inside him. Nobody was really talking. That's what I remember most about the crowd. 20,000 people on a street built for 4,000, and the loudest sound was shoes shifting on wet stone. Adaline had been our queen for 52 years. 52. I was 19 when she came to the throne, and I had a full head of hair and a bad opinion about everything. My mother made me watch the coronation on a borrowed television with a picture like a snowstorm. And now I was 60 and my knees hurt and she was gone. And the strange thing, the thing that surprised me, was that it felt like a door had shut in my own house. You don't expect that. You think she's a woman in a hat on a coin. And then the day comes and you find out she was one of the walls of your life. The procession was to start from the palace at 9 and come down Cathedral Row at 9:40. They had it timed to the minute. That's the thing about these occasions. People think it's all grief and flowers, but underneath it is arithmetic. Somebody sat in a room with a stopwatch and worked out how fast 6 horses walk on wet cobbles. At 9:32, I heard the drums. You feel them first, actually, before you hear them, in your chest. A slow, dragging beat, deliberately slower than a heartbeat, so that your own heart tries to slow down to meet it and can't. Whoever invented that knew exactly what they were doing. Then the pipes. Then the crowd going still in a wave. You could actually see it move down the street, heads turning one after the other like wheat. And then the guard. I should tell you about the guard, because you might not know them the way we know them. The Queen's household regiment. Gray coats, black cuffs, the tall bearskins, they are not decoration. Every man in that regiment has served somewhere real first, the ice patrols in the north or the border or worse. You don't get the gray coat by being handsome, you get it by being unbreakable. And they do not move, that's the whole legend of them. There's a story every child in Ostwick knows, about a guardsman in 1961 who stood through a hailstorm at the palace gates with blood running down his face from a broken cheekbone and didn't so much as blink. My grandfather swore he saw it. My grandfather also swore he once caught a fish the size of a dog, so you know, but the point stands. They do not move. They came down the row 2 by 2, flanking the gun carriage, and the coffin on it was small. That shocked me. She had been a large presence, and it was a small coffin, draped in the standard, with a single wreath of white heather on top and her crown sitting there catching what little light there was. Behind it walked her family, behind them the ministers, behind them a lot of people in very good coats. And nobody made a sound. Now here is where I start counting. They were about level with my window. I could have reached out and touched the horse's breath. It was steaming in the cold when I noticed the guardsman on the near side of the carriage. Third from the front. Younger than the others, I thought, though it's hard to tell under the bearskin. Everything about him was exactly right. The angle of the head, the rifle, the step. Except his eyes were moving. I don't know if anybody else caught it, but I fix things for a living and I notice when something isn't running true. His head was locked forward, but his eyes were going left, to the crowd, searching. Once, twice. Scanning the faces along the barrier like a man looking for his own child in a train station. I thought that's odd. 2 seconds later, he stepped out of line. I want you to understand what that means. He didn't stumble. He didn't faint. Men faint at these things, it happens. They lock their knees and go down like a dropped plank, and two others close the gap, and the parade eats the gap, and nobody ever speaks of it again. That's expected. There's a procedure. This was not that. He turned, deliberately, 90 degrees on the beat, and he walked out of the formation toward the crowd. The sound that went through that street, I've never heard anything like it. 20,000 people inhaling at once. It was like a wave pulling back off a beach. The man next to me said, "Oh no," just that, quietly, "Oh no." Because we all knew what we were watching. We were watching a soldier throw away everything. On live television, on the worst day in 52 years. His career gone, his name gone. Tomorrow he'd be a headline, and in 10 years he'd be a joke in a pub quiz. You remember the one who broke ranks at Adeline's funeral. Somebody near the barrier started to shout something and swallowed it. He kept walking. And here's the thing that made my skin go cold: the rest of the formation didn't react. They didn't turn their heads. The carriage didn't stop. The drums didn't miss. It was as if the world had a hole in it and everybody had agreed not to look at the hole. I started counting because I couldn't do anything else. 1, 2, 3. At the barrier about 15 paces from my door, there was an old man. I'd seen him earlier and thought nothing of it. He'd been there since before I opened. Very old, the kind of old where the skin goes almost translucent, where you can see the map of everything underneath. He was wearing a uniform. Not a good one. That's what I mean when I say I thought nothing of it. It was an old service coat, moss green, the wrong shade for anything current, and it had clearly been pressed with enormous care, and it clearly did not fit him anymore. Old men do this. They put on the coat from 50 years ago, and they come and stand, and everybody smiles at them kindly and thinks, bless him. He had been standing at attention for 4.5 hours. I know because I'd watched him. Every time I looked up from the counter, he was still there, chin up, shoulders back, shaking. Not shaking from emotion. Shaking the way a very old body shakes when it's been asked to do something it did decades ago. His hand was up at his temple in salute, and it kept sliding down, and he kept putting it back. Nobody was helping him. The people around him weren't unkind. They just didn't understand what they were looking at. To them, he was scenery. The guardsman walked straight to him. 4, 5, 6. He stopped in front of the old man. And then, and I will see this until I die, that soldier, in front of 20,000 people and 40 million watching at home, brought his own hand up and returned the salute. Held it. 7. Then he reached over the barrier, took the old man's arm, and lifted the barrier aside. 8. And he walked him out onto the road. 9. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Somewhere a child asked a question, and got shushed so fast it was almost violent. The guardsman walked the old man, slowly, so slowly, matching his shuffle exactly, out to the center of the road, behind the gun carriage. And then he stood him there in the space directly behind the coffin, between the carriage and the family. And then the procession stopped. The whole thing. 6 horses, the carriage, the coffin, the crown, the family, the ministers, the entire choreographed weight of a state funeral, stopped dead on Cathedral Row because one guardsman had put a shaking old stranger in its path. I remember thinking in a numb sort of way, this is a catastrophe. This is the end of that boy. And that's when the colonel came down the line. He came from the front, walking fast, and everybody's stomach dropped together. You could feel it. 20,000 people all thinking the same thing. Here it comes. He reached them, he stood in front of the guardsman, and he looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned to the old man, and he saluted him too. And then he took a folded paper out of his breast pocket. They'd put loudspeakers up along the row for the service. Somebody had the sense to switch them on. There was a crackle, that awful electric cough, and then the colonel's voice came out across that whole silent street, and it was not steady. He said the Queen had left instructions. Not in the state papers, not in the official order of service that had been rehearsed for 11 days. A separate letter, written in her own hand, sealed, and given to the regiment 2 years before she died, with one instruction on the envelope, to be opened on the morning of my funeral. And in it she had written that there was one man who was to walk behind her, before her ministers, before her family, directly behind her. His name was Nicholas Brandt. He was 94 years old. And in February of 1946, when he was 14 and she was 11, he had gone into the Vess River after her. I didn't know the story. Almost nobody did. It had never been in a single book about her, and there are hundreds of books about her. She'd been skating with her sister on the frozen bend below the old mill, the way children did then, before anyone worried about anything. The ice went. She went under, and the current took her 20 feet downstream under the sheet, and she was, by every account, gone. A boy from the mill cottages went in after her. 14. Broke the ice with his forearms ahead of himself, following the shape of her under the sheet, in water cold enough to stop a grown man's heart in 90 seconds. He got her out. He lost 3 fingers on his left hand to the cold, and most of the hearing in one ear, and he spent the next 11 weeks in a bed in Marin. The letter said, and the colonel had to stop twice to get through it, the letter said that she had never once in 52 years been able to find a way to thank him that did not embarrass him, because he had refused every honor she had ever offered. Refused a medal, refused a title, refused money. Wrote her a note in 1949 that said, "Ma'am, anyone would have." She wrote, "He would not take anything from me while I lived, so he shall have this. Let him walk, let them see him. He is the reason there was anything to bury." The colonel folded the paper, and I heard it start behind me, one person clapping. Just one. Some woman somewhere back in the crowd who couldn't hold it in. And then it came. God, it came like weather. 20,000 people on a street where nobody had spoken above a whisper for 4 hours. And it broke over that road like a sea, and it went on and on and on. And I could hear it rolling away up the road toward the palace as the news of it traveled to people who couldn't even see what had happened. The old man stood there in his badly fitting coat with his hand at his temple, shaking, and he did not smile and he did not weep. He just stood. The guardsman had already stepped back to his place at the carriage, locked forward, eyes front, as if none of it had ever happened. And then the drums started again, and they walked her the last 400 yards to the cathedral, with a 94-year-old millworker's son from the Vess Valley walking alone behind her coffin, and every soul on that road on their feet. He died the following spring. Brandt. There was a small piece about it in the back of the paper. They asked the guardsman about it afterwards, of course. Every journalist in Ostwick wanted him. He gave exactly one interview, 4 sentences long, and when they asked him what went through his mind when he stepped out of line, he said he'd had his orders in his pocket since 6 that morning, and he'd been terrified the whole march that he wouldn't find the right man in the crowd, that there'd be some other old fellow in an old coat, and he'd take the wrong one. Then they asked him what he'd have done if he hadn't found him. He said, kept looking. "I still fix clocks. I still open at 6:30. The barriers came down that same afternoon, and by Thursday it was just a street again with buses on it. But I'll tell you what I think about, when I'm sat at the bench with a movement in pieces in front of me and the loop in my eye. Everybody watching that day thought they were seeing a man break the rules. That's what it looked like. That's what it will always look like in the photographs, a soldier out of line, the formation ruined, the machine gone wrong. He was the only one on that whole road doing exactly what he'd been told. That's the thing about people, isn't it? We're so quick. We see a man step out of the line and we already know the whole story of him. We almost never know what's in his pocket.